This may be a bit challenging. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin with the first question. I'm going to ask you just to briefly say your name and title before you respond, rather than introducing everyone in the interest of time. So just last week, U.S. National Intelligence Director Dan Coats said the warning lights are blinking red again. And he was comparing the cyber threat to the United States today with a threat posed by international terrorism in the years leading up to the 9/11 attacks. And so my question for the panel is, in terms of both likelihood and impact, what do you see as the most severe threat to the security of New York? And would you say that it's cybersecurity, or are there other pressing challenges that are more important? So things like terrorism, the possibility of a biochemical attack, or something else. So does anyone want to tackle that question?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Currao. I'm Deputy Chief of the New York City Fire Department. I just recently had the major challenge of stepping into Chief Joe Pfeiffer's shoes as Chief of Counterterrorism and Emergency Preparedness. So I've been on the job all 4 weeks. But I did previously work for him as an intel analyst for 4 years. And I totally agree with that, that assessment. And the reason that I think that cyber is one of our biggest challenges. And it shares some of the same challenges with other types of threat vectors, is that it's difficult to, in terms of its consequences, to create. We have to have a common operating picture. And it is it's rapidly evolving. And it's what I call is outside sort of my knowledge comfort zone. Like I said, I worked for the fire department as an intel analyst for 4 years. I could talk active shooter, I could talk improvised explosives, I can talk vertical threat, high-rise terrorism all day. But cyber is rapidly evolving. It is something that has to be hit on in so many different levels, at a policy level, operations, technical level. We were just having a nice conversation before, and how hard it is to get the technical expertise to deal with it. So I would definitely, from my perspective, and I want to pass it on, one of our biggest challenges. So.
Good morning. So, Bill, my name is Bill Sweeney. I'm the Assistant Director in charge of the New York FBI office, which is your local FBI office here. I would say, obviously, DNI is accurate in the challenge of cyber. For us locally, our priority is still terrorism. So for our agency, we do a process which we call a threat review prioritization every year, sometimes every other year, where we rank and stack a lot of the threats branch by branch, or what we call program by program. So we will go through CT threats, counterintelligence threats or espionage, cyber threats, and then criminal threats. And in those priorities, CT or counterterrorism still remains number one, counterintelligence still remains number two, and cyber number three in a formal ranking system. But when you look at how cyber has morphed over, especially the past few years, the issue of cyber permeates every single threat we look at. So whether it is terrorism and groups that are executing either just using cyber techniques to recruit, or if they're looking to utilize cyber techniques as part of an attack vector, or maybe to supplement a physical attack vector. Cyber certainly intermixes in the counterterrorism mission. Obviously, in our counterintelligence mission, cyber and the fact that nation-state actors and others, sometimes a blended threat of nation-state actors and criminal actors, are certainly working to steal your stuff if you're from the private sector, to steal your stuff if you're from the government sector, to manipulate your stuff. So we see cyber in all aspects of our counterintelligence mission. Obviously, there are some standalone cyber issues from frauds. We see gangs using what some of our older workforce would refer to as a purely cyber issue as they utilize social media, as they utilize encrypted currency platforms. So it cuts across every violation and every program that we work.
So I serve as the chairman of the Internet and New Technologies in the New York State Assembly. And in that position, we're very focused on cybersecurity and how New York State manages, holds, transfers, stores data. Very, very, very important that we are the keepers of your most valuable information, right? When your child is born, we record it and give the birth certificates. When folks die, we give the death certificates. When people get married, we record it. When you vote, we record that. What happens when that information gets breached? 2 years ago, in not too far from here in Kings County, during a presidential primary, over 170,000 voter files were lost. That happened in New York not too long ago. So how do we deal with that? And that's something that should not happen in this country, and it should not happen in this state. We're also dealing with, sometimes with threats from within and from without, right? There's still a conversation of whether or not foreign interests really hacked into our elections. And if they did hack into our elections, it happened in the States. So are we properly securing this kind of information? So I'll talk in more detail about some of the stuff that we are proposing or trying to do, but cybersecurity is a very important thing. Last summer there was a breach with Equifax, where half of the country's information was misappropriated. We didn't even find out from Equifax until 2 months later. So it's a major issue. How we just generally, not just cybersecurity. How we deal with data. Do we have the proper laws in place? Should we employ something like the GDPR here? So there are a lot of big issues that we're dealing with, and we're still grappling with all this stuff.
Thank you. Stephen Coraggi, I'm an associate partner with IBM Security. I focus on our security intelligence practice. And I think going back to Mary Beth's question around biggest threats to the city, I think one of the biggest threats here is if there were a coordinated attack between the IT infrastructure of the city and a physical attack. It's a traditional physical attack of the security, so a traditional terrorist attack. So if you think about how this city operates in IoT devices and connected vehicles and connected systems, if a terrorist or an adversary threat were to take down those systems in parallel with an actual physical attack or some type of terrorist attack or a bomb threat, that would be extremely disruptive to the city. There are connected systems here. There's emergency routes that are connected via the city of New York and the technology here. If that were to be taken down or compromised in parallel with some other type of mass casualty event, major disruption here. If you think, the cell service, all of the connected systems, the lighting, the thoroughfares for emergency vehicles, that is critical as we respond to these events. So I think that is a major threat here. I think another major threat is really just making sure that we're prepared and we can respond to events. Training, awareness, making sure that everyone is vigilant in terms of what they see and hear is also critical to protecting the city.
Good morning. I'm Darryl Ramsey, the principal cybersecurity architect for ePlus Technologies. And I have to echo some of the comments that were made just a little earlier. But I would add a little something else to it. One of the biggest threats is the way we leverage technology, right? We're a more connected society, and this is globally. And so the more we're connected, the more we're connected. So a digital threat, a cybersecurity event is more apt to happen in that realm, almost to match what we do in the physical realm. It's a highway, if you will, that has actors being able to deliver their bad actions to a wide audience very quickly. It becomes a headless or an anonymous type of attack, depending on what type of attack that we're getting on the cyberspace. So very easy and very cheap. Matter of fact, we were just looking at ePlus, an attack that's been happening and growing very much like ransomware, which is cryptojacking. A different way of using an old technique, a ransomware type delivery technique to deliver on a newer promise, which is stealing cryptocurrency across the internet, right? These things will destabilize economic infrastructure. In New York City, we're the bastion and the home of a lot of financial services. If we're to destabilize, or a bad actor to destabilize that environment, it has large rippling effect from a cyber terrorism perspective. So that aspect of the shifting threat landscape is something that I look at quite often. Another threat I think that happens from a terrorism, cyber terrorism standpoint is something that we deliver. As citizens, we want expediency and convenience in the way we live our lives. We open ourselves up, right, with applications that we put on our mobile devices and things like that. So we have a tyranny of time between, do we go for convenience and expedience in terms of the way we live our lives, and giving up privacy or not giving up privacy, and allowing terrorists to behave the way they do online. That tends to be a big threat, especially in New York City. We're a very vibrant society. You put that in the global landscape, and you can imagine the amount of openings we have to be attacked. So from a cybersecurity perspective, I think that's one of the major events, right? And I have to agree with Stephen here. When you have an infrastructure as large as ours, we have a large transportation hub in society. We move around very quickly. We're relying more and more on IoT devices, which give us rich information so that we can move around and conduct our daily business. We're a great target for a bad actor. If we're not careful on the digital landscape, we open ourselves up. So that, I think, is one of the biggest issues. Our need for convenience and expediency as we live our daily lives. It's us, the citizens, right, that we need to modify our behaviors just a little bit.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name's Oliver Friedrich, and I'm VP of Automation and Orchestration at Splunk. We're a big data company. And I've actually been in the security space for about 25 years, even though I may not be that old. But it's evolved pretty dramatically, I think, since the early days of, in the 90s, we had maybe 1,000 security vulnerabilities that we knew of, right, across the entire world, like in software that we had to patch against and guard against. Fast forward to today, we have over 100,000, right? So it's a very asymmetric problem. The attacker just needs to exploit one of those. We have 100,000 that we have to defend against. That's extremely difficult, right? And they keep multiplying as we find new vulnerabilities, we create new software. I think Mark Andreessen said, software is eating the world, right? Everything's driven by software now. And all of our systems are now driven by software as well. So the fact that we have that many vulnerabilities is a very difficult challenge, right? And we need to use automation to actually protect ourselves. I agree with Stephen and Darryl on the cyber to kinetic attacks, where if an attacker can exploit cyber vulnerabilities, whether it's in critical infrastructure and medical devices, or other critical areas, all of which have proven to be vulnerable in the past, right? This is not science fiction. That can lead to ultimate human casualties, right? I think that's where things get very scary. Fortunately, we haven't seen a lot of that to date, right? We've seen ransomware attacks, right, going back to Atlanta, where they were hit by a malware called SamSam that infected critical systems. 5 of the 13 local departments in Atlanta, the city departments, were taken offline as a result of that ransomware. People couldn't pay their water bills. The police department record systems was down. Infrastructure maintenance reporting was down, right? So that's a real world example of how cyber can affect kinetic. Now in that case, the attackers were looking for essentially a $50,000 ransom. But before they could actually collect it, or before Atlanta could try to pay it, the payment system was taken offline. So Atlanta had to pay $2.6 million to recover from that attack in incident response, in investigation, forensics, and trying to get their systems back. But at the same time, the data was still encrypted, so they couldn't get it back, right? So the attacker in this case was looking for monetary gain. But it's very easy to disguise that type of an attack as monetary gain when it could be an act of terrorism as well. Because essentially the data was non-recoverable, you couldn't get it back. So there's, I think over the last 20 to 25 years, there's been a gradual progression to more world political level attacks like this versus in the 90s it was, again, hackers just having fun, right? So I think the implications have changed dramatically. As soon as we cross that cyber-kinetic line, things start getting very, very serious.
Great, thank you. So now that we're all sufficiently scared, I want to ask the panel how your organizations are addressing these threats, what new initiatives you have, and how you're working across sectors. And in particular, with regard to terrorism, I wanted to ask Assistant Director Sweeney and Chief Currao, how your organizations are adapting to the changing terrorism threats. So we've seen a rise in lone actor terrorism, again, this use of cyber. So and also you mentioned high-rise terrorism, which is particularly important for New York City. So how are you taking on these threats? So we all feel a little better, hopefully.
Thank you. So the biggest ingredient, the biggest magic ingredient to putting this together is our collaboration. Is developing our common operating picture. Bill knows he has a captain from the fire department in his Joint Terrorism Task Force. Very first time in U.S. history we've ever had that. And it's very, very important for non-traditional agencies such as the fire department, such as the emergency medical services, such as the Department of Health, to be part of this intel enterprise, so to speak. Not only as consumers, but we also find as producers, because we also bring something to the table from our very unique perspective. So going back to your question about the threats, whether it's cyber, whether it's high-rise terrorism, whether it's active shooter, we all approach it from, we're looking at the same problem, but we're all bringing something different to the table. Right now we're writing an emergency response plan. We're very concerned about an incident of a coordinated complex attack in the high-rise environment. When I say complex attack, where the terrorists are combining, much like the cyber to kinetic type of thing, they're combining active shooter with fire and smoke as a weapon with possible improvised explosive devices. We're not writing that emergency response plan by ourselves. We've been actually working on that project for years with the FBI. We've also working on it with the NYPD. They're literally sitting, writing the emergency response plan with us. Just recently, we had a full active shooter exercise in Carnegie Hall as part of the National Homeland Security Conference. We did not do it alone. It was a collaborative effort. NYPD, FDNY, New York City Emergency Management. So any of these things that we're addressing are always from a group effort. So.
Thanks, Tom. So to piggyback on that a little bit, and I know Jimmy was up here earlier talking about some of the work that everybody does jointly, but to put folks a little bit at rest. So the threat is changing both on the CT side and the cyber side. On the CT side, we see our actors getting younger. It's low tech. On the cyber side, some of the sophisticated tech is going to folks that have no business or no expertise. I could do a ransomware attack at this point, right? There's ready-made kits for kids, and I'm probably one of the least bright folks on cyber out there. Low tech, the flash to bang on the CT side, what we call the flash to bang, from the time somebody is interested or even piques their interest in wanting to do some bad act to the time they act, has shrunk. The way they talk, the way they communicate, it used to be 5 years ago, if you wanted to be part of a sophisticated terror group or conduct a sophisticated attack, you would have to be vetted by an organization. You'd likely have to travel. You'd likely have to get trained and then deploy back. So the last time we saw in this city somebody deploying back following that model was probably what we called Operation High Rise, or the 2009 planned attacks of the subway system by Najib Bouazizi and crew. But since then, the actor and the speed has changed dramatically. All that is fought through partnerships. So as an example, where you sit, where your local FBI sits today, is actually 61 separate agencies sitting together side by side. So our goal is you should be able to walk into any one of my squad areas in our organization and not be able to differentiate between the NYPD detective, the expert from the FDNY, the state trooper, the FBI agent, the linguist, the analyst, across the board. Every one of our groups is segregated by threat, and in almost everything that this FBI office does, we do in partnership with somebody else, with the rare exception of maybe espionage, even corruption. So in corruption, we have NYPD officers that sit side by side with us in our squad area. In cyber, we certainly have a cyber task force. The new change that this office has done is we've started to bring in some private sector entities, depending on the nature, sometimes the specific nature of the threat, where we can sit side by side and share that data quickly. We've also brought in, over the last year and a half, foreign partners directly into our space, rather than use our traditional construct, which is a legal attaché or an FBI office overseas. There's 65 offices overseas, 64 offices overseas, about 200 countries are covered by that. But to address the speed of the threat, we have brought some of those folks to sit over here side by side with us. The relationship with the NYPD is phenomenal. A lot of us talk about this region of the country being the golden age of law enforcement. No offense to Tom, who's an FDNY partner, but almost all of us know each other from the time we started at a supervisory level and have moved up through the chain of command. And the goal is that we are setting that precedent for the workforce that follows us. So my current supervisors, my line agents, should know no different. They shouldn't even have to remember yesteryear where there was competition, there was intel sharing issues. That doesn't exist. Jimmy talked about how the Chelsea bombing was handled. Evidence went to Quantico. Chief Boyce, I remember Bob Boyce being on scene, discussing how we were going to use NYPD equipment, and I forget the name of the process, versus the FBI total station system, which was painstakingly slow. And here we had this NYPD system. Hey, we're using that. Whatever's quicker, whatever gets us to the answer faster. Remarkable difference in the landscape. The last thing I would mention is the push that we are trying to make with private sector is a huge one. We rely on a lot of the data and a lot of the partnerships, probably for many of you sitting in this audience. Paul Tierney, who I went to school with at Villanova and suffered as a midshipman early in the morning, still keeps me up in the morning through your system. I often get the alerts through data miner, somebody shooting them to me and waking me up. Usually they're all somebody else's problem. But it's that speed that we need with the partnerships with the private sector on everything we do, from CT to CI, counterintelligence, to cyber.
First, I have to say that New York State has, we have great agencies. We have NYPD, the FDNY, the FBI. You guys do a great job with protecting us and preventing a lot. There's a lot of stuff that they cannot say that they have done, and they do a really fantastic job. Some of the things that we're trying to do, our role in the legislature is to try to make sure that our agencies and partners have the resources and funding to be able to have these kinds of programs, but also to identify where we should go, where we should be. Government, generally speaking, is clumsy, big, and slow. And if you watch, I just watched the soccer World Cup, and if you see that when people pass the ball, they pass the ball to where you should go. They lead the ball. And as lawmakers, as policymakers, we should be going to where this world is going. And that's very important. And especially important where things don't wait for us, right? As technology progresses, as the world progresses, they don't wait for our, when we're ready. So some of the things that we're trying to do, we put a bill out to see that can we put certain information, for example, like voter files or voter records or sensitive data on the blockchain, so that for voting, for example, people register to vote. They may change their party affiliation. They may vote one year, and not vote another time. But there's a lot of access in and out to this voter information from within and from without. How do we properly secure that? So we're trying to see that if we could, try to see if we could use blockchain technology to be able to protect that kind of that voter data. Given all the different issues with respect to it or not, we're trying to see, can we employ the best kinds of encryption out there. Another thing that's very important is that when it comes to making these decisions, I find too often we make these decisions on where we should go in a silo. Government has to engage the private sector better, right? We have to engage the experts better. I don't know the details of cybersecurity or what have you. And one of the things that's very important is that when you're tasked with making policy, when you make bad policy, the ripple effects last a long time. And sometimes we keep bad policy just because it's there. So it's very important for us to get it right and for us to engage with the experts early. So a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do is this year we passed a law to be able to put a commission together to figure out, how to use some of these technologies. And, hopefully the governor will sign it, but it would pass both houses. But it's very important for public to engage the experts in private in this space.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the city and state is interesting. We do a lot of work with both state, local, and federal governments. And when you think about local municipalities, cities, states, governments, you think about kind of slow systems, slow adoption for technology, and on the way government moves, it's kind of lagging most of kind of corporate America. But I think what we've seen here, at least from a city standpoint, because we've been working with the city for a greater portion of 5+ years, is really the move from legacy platforms and legacy applications to more advanced technologies and solutions. So 5 years ago, it was legacy infrastructure, legacy applications, legacy platforms. Now there is a significant push and acceleration to the cloud. We're seeing a lot of the applications, customer-facing, citizen-facing applications such as 311, the 911 system, the response systems, moving to cloud platforms, which requires additional level of security, but there's really, a movement towards more advanced technologies, advanced security, advanced control. So we're seeing a lot of that in the city. So rest assured, there's a lot of adoption. I think Assemblyman Clyde and some of the others here, there's a lot of push towards investment in the areas, looking at kind of what big banks, big financials are doing in the space. And the city certainly is on par with some of the large corporate kind of clients that we work with in terms of the move, how they're securing the cloud, how the boundaries are now kind of dispersed, and how they're protecting it. I mean, if you think about kind of the way data is kind of translated or transfers through the system here, we're helping the city in terms of monitoring, managing, and responding to information that is now outside of the traditional walls of the city. So there's a lot of kind of challenges and opportunity there, but the city is certainly taking a proactive approach to being more advanced than a lot of other cities that we work with. So it's a great job there.
I feel like a music band sharing this mic.
Yeah, that's good.
So one of the things that ePlus is doing, and many technology companies, especially in Silicon Valley, is echoing some of the things we heard earlier in the comments, which is collaborating a lot better. The good news there is that, for example, just on a personal level, for me, it's all about protecting those that protect us, right? Lest we try to call on uniformed services and they don't have the tools, technology tools, to do the things that they need to do to protect the citizenry. So we pay attention to the tools that they need to use and support the collaboration that we heard earlier. It's important for us to remove the complexities in some of those interoperability challenges that technology can bring to the table. It happens a lot. For example, today, I'm in the room with NVIDIA and Pure, two of our technology partners, to do more with artificial intelligence, for example. Those are tools that are coming down the road just to remove some of the doom and gloom. The good news is that technology is moving to where the ball is moving to from a technology perspective. Machine learning and deep learning, things that feed into artificial intelligence, for example, have been around for better than 50 years or more. The thing that has changed there is the tools and technology advancements that we could grapple onto now are now at our disposal. And we could give that to uniform services and first responders for them to do their jobs. For example, one of the biggest things, especially in New York City, on a national level as well, is the use of sensor networks. And I dare say video surveillance is a sensor network. For us, it's putting things like AI into video surveillance and the collection of that data from video, so we get the right information into the right hands at the right time, shortening the amount of time to respond to a particular event, whether it be cyber or physical. So, you know, at ePlus, that's one of the things that we're trying to do quite a bit. And I keep saying ePlus, but it's a technology thing, right? It's not just an ePlus thing. I think every technology company has been trying to move that level of complexity and create an ecosystem where, you know, folks that need to do their jobs don't have to deal with how do I have one technology work with another. To go along the lines of video, for example, you know, we have over, you know, 500 million cameras or something like that as sensors in the world today, you know, projected to grow to about 1 billion in another couple of years, 4 or 5 years from now. All that data and rich information that's being pulled back is usually used for forensic purposes or detection purposes. The information stored in that video or other images is much more richer than what we're utilizing it for today. The technology is able to kind of parse through that and support some of the collaborative efforts that we heard earlier from Department of Transportation, FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force, NYPD, and other agencies that would be interested in that information to help reshape traffic patterns, for example, you know, post-event. I think most folks, you know, we're thinking about cyber and physical security from when the event happens. The real work, I dare say, unfortunately, you know, beyond recovery, is, you know, response to that is where do we go next? How do we, you know, fortify ourselves so that we're not hit either cyber or physically the next go round? The information that we glean from the camera systems, as one sensor, there's many sensors, but from a camera system is very important. So we're concentrating very heavily on how do we not only help the recovery efforts, but fortifying things going forward. And it's a heavy reliance on artificial intelligence. I know we're hearing a lot of that nowadays, but it's something that's here and very important. All of us pretty much use AI in some aspect in our lives, right? Whether it be Google Assistants and things that we have online, and you know, we're relying on it. It's becoming more and more adopted in our society. To understand that landscape and protect it from a cybersecurity perspective is one aspect, but to support law enforcement and first responding efforts is of high regard as well.
So I think we've seen, you know, like my colleagues mentioned, right, the hygiene and protecting is really step number one. But then after you protect, it really comes down to can you respond faster? So the typical response time, if you look at cyber, is anywhere from 10 minutes best case to 11 hours worst case. That's research that was done up at Johns Hopkins APL, Applied Physics Lab, along with DHS. So that's pretty sad, right? 11 hours to respond to a threat means that an attacker can be exfiltrating data, doing damage, propagating within the network, right? We need to do better than that. So what we're seeing is we're seeing the adoption of technologies to automate that response. In particular, here in New York, some of the agencies are leveraging automation technology to be able to respond faster to threats. We're able to reduce that response time from 10 minutes and 11 hours worst case down to 1 second best case and 10-minute worst case. So that's over a 99% improvement in being able to respond, investigate, enrich, hunt for threats in the environment. At the same time, automation can increase capacity as well. So you're not reliant on humans, which is one of the biggest challenges, right? Especially here in the city. All of the cybersecurity analysts that I know are constantly churning between all of the big financials, right? It's impossible to hire. And when you do, they're essentially moving within a year or two to another financial, right? And many of those are companies who have the exact same problem. So the talent pool isn't getting any easier to hire. We're training and we're educating as much as we can, right, to train the next generation to help with that. But ultimately, there just aren't enough resources to be able to actually analyze all of these security events that we're seeing. We estimate that there's about 1 million people missing in the workforce today that we need worldwide to be able to actually triage and deal with all of the events and all of the threats that are being seen across, you know, all of our enterprises and agencies. So that's where I think response and relying on new technologies to automate that becomes really critical. The second piece is collaboration, right? We heard the commissioner talk about interagency collaboration, which is super positive. I think that similarly, private-public sector collaboration between private sector and multiple public sector agencies is really key. So being able to work together, it's a team sport, right? It's not a siloed, out for yourself type of an event. We need to work together to be able to solve these problems. The attackers are working together, right? So we have to work together to defeat them.
Great, thank you. So if we think about, I was thinking about post 9/11, and I think New York has actually fared quite well post 9/11 as a result of the good work that you all do. But as you mentioned, there's this sort of change in the rapidity of threats. So we're seeing things, the flash to bang you mentioned is much quicker. Our cyber responses have to be quicker. Automation, it sounds like, can deal with some of these things. There's a lot of cooperation going on, but it seems like there could be more. And when I think about terrorists, who I know better, but also cyber criminals and cyber terrorists and things like that, they're constantly innovating. They're constantly responding to the security measures that we have in place. So how can you best anticipate the threats on the horizon? And what are some of the challenges that you're facing? And how can we maybe, and you can feel free to jump in whenever, but how can we maybe work together a little bit better to reduce those barriers to cooperation? And then I just have to ask, as a citizen, how do we sort of balance this cooperation with sort of our privacy, privacy issues? So, anyone?
It's interesting. On another level of cybersecurity is the cyber criminals, not just the cyber terrorists, but the cyber criminals. We found that for as a lawmaker, we have to really make sure that we protect our seniors and young folks. And we find that we have one of the things that's important, that's incumbent on us is people need training on how to use social media and their digital presence. So we found that in families, younger people usually like to tell what they're doing, where they are, if they're on vacation, if they're away, or what have you. And if the family's going away, that you're telling the world, a lot of folks are broadcasting that we're not home or what have you. And we found that is how we deal with your privacy and how you deal with that kind of thing is very important when it comes to criminality. Another thing that's very important is the power of social media and how young folks use that. So we're dealing with bullying and how these people how these younger people transact online. One of the things that's important for us to do, and we're trying to look at that, is how do we create an environment where we train people on how to properly use, and we're trying to engage the NYPD on this better, and different agencies in the schools. How do we engage where we tell people how to properly use the social media and the internet properly with respect to your information, where you're going to be, your whereabouts, or what have you. So that's a very important thing that we're trying to look at.
I think we also see that in the CVE space, so in terms of youth using the internet and possibility of online radicalization, so just training of parents to know what their children are doing online and who they're engaging with, so yeah.
Want me to give it a shot? Okay, so you touched on civil liberties a little bit and then some of the challenges and then the cooperation. So the cooperation is excellent. There's ways to improve. Like Oliver was talking about, we obviously have our workforce recruiting problems, especially in the area of cyber. And there's some of us who think there's ways to maybe innovate around that. How do you work with private sector to address some of what you were talking about, where folks are jumping from company to company and job to job, and how do we keep our own? So a couple of years ago, just in our office, we lost, I think, 9 cyber agents. It was basically a personal network that left us all at once. One guy got a job, started offering others jobs, and they're making 5-6 times the salary of an FBI agent. Normal agent would dream of that salary. But one of them came back, and one of them came back because of the mission, right? So it's hard to preach mission, especially to a group I'm talking to in front now, who makes a lot more than a new agent or a new analyst would make, but I'm looking at that table that's sitting in front of me, a group of young folks, and I'm looking at the folks that are sitting with Paul's table. I'll beat you on mission every day of the year, but How do I address the fact that companies also need to protect themselves? Is there some sort of process that we could set up without giving somebody a competitive advantage and all the legal issues and the privacy issues that follow with that, where I can take some of a workforce, bring them over to our side for a little bit, maybe send some of our workforce over somewhere else for a couple of years, back and forth. It's going to take a brain bigger than mine to figure out. But if we don't innovate in that next step where we do even more with private sector than we are now, really we're not advantaging ourselves either from the USG perspective or from your company's perspectives where you're getting the latest and greatest intel. We've innovated all sorts of ways in the CT mission space, whether that is for deploying personnel and teams overseas. So the one advantage to this office and for the partners that are part of this office is the New York office on the CT threat and the criminal threat also has responsibilities for Canada, the UK, Western Europe, and all of Africa. So we see all those threats first, long before many other cities will see them. And the personnel from your teams and Tom's team are part of that. They deploy with us, they operate overseas, they come back, they take that knowledge and push it out. Other areas that we need to figure out, the biggest one in the world, actually across all the threats that we deal with right now, is encryption. Right? There's obviously a balance of civil liberties and encryption. And some of that balance has been lost in the debate over previous years of we want a backdoor, we want all your stuff, blah, blah, blah. I have an iPhone for a reason. That's so I can't have my own agency get into it, I guess. But there are ways to balance that, and we've had a balance for 240 plus years where with valid process, not everything is off limits. And so how do we get to that, and how do we have an adult conversation about that? But encryption across all of our threats, whether it's data in motion, data at rest, is a huge challenge for our agency and several others that work with us. But there are ways to address any challenge, I think. Others will disagree, but I think they're wrong.
Yeah, I think I think someone brought it up earlier. I think there's kind of never-ending discussion between protecting our citizens and data security and kind of what's privacy. And I think there were Facebook hearings a few months ago on kind of what kind of access corporations should have. I think when you look at the city here, there's an initiative called NYC3, which is the Cyber Command Center that was developed under the city that does an exceptional job of sharing information and developing standards for the agencies. So the command center will be the kind of bearer of what kind of technologies are used, the platforms, kind of controls are in place. That's a great job of kind of sharing information between things like the MTA, Department of Technology, and kind of other agencies. So I think it's a kind of great move. I think the challenge that this city faces, as other cities, is the sharing of information between the public and private sector. I mean, you think about this city and the amount of money spent in private sector from the big financials and other companies that are developing kind of exploits and knowing what vulnerabilities exist. That information needs to be shared with the public sector. There are groups and agencies like ISAC, which is information sharing and collaboration groups that are built or have been built to share information across both public and private sector. So there is a move in the right direction there, but we still have seen a lack of sharing of intelligence and IOCs from both public and private sector back and forth, and I think that's a challenge. I mean, if one firm is investing in understanding threats and exploits, that needs to be shared with other firms to protect their base and their citizens. So we're seeing a gap there.
Yeah, I'd have to echo some of the comments, but the one thing that I think needs to happen more is the collaboration between higher education, research and development, what we're doing from a Silicon Valley or tech company perspective, and the public sector. So if there was a task force, and I heard there was a commission or commissions to be formed, that's the one thing that I think needs to happen to help collaboration a little bit more, to gain more content, fresh information, especially from young folks, right? My daughter's going to kill me for saying this, but She and many in her age bracket, in the 20s, don't look at privacy the way some of us do that have more gray hair on their chins than others. But the view of privacy is different, right? The way we need to meet those challenges and how they leverage social media, how they leverage technology is a little bit different than some of us may think about, right? So having folks like that at the table to discuss where we go from a technology perspective in support of law enforcement efforts is hugely important. As we heard earlier, some of the actors and bad actors, unfortunately, and some of the curious actors that are online doing things like ransomware and experimenting with cryptojacking, well, it could be a 13-year-old kid, right? It's a $30 rootkit that you could buy off of Amazon. I probably shouldn't even told you guys that, but it's a very cheap rootkit.
It's on Prime Day, Prime Day too.
Right, Prime Day. But you could do that, right? You don't have to be a genius to go out and do these bad things, and sometimes out of curiosity. So education is a big thing, right? And talking to our younger community and bringing them to the table with law enforcement so they understand the seriousness and weightedness as to what it means from a national and a global perspective. And having content, fresh information from technology vendors is hugely important. Lest we forget, we're the ones creating some of the technologies that's being leveraged. Because it's a tool we present it may be used in an inadvertent, sometimes advertent, illicit way. But we know, the possibility of that beast, right? So to train how to tame the beast, watch the beast, and do the right mitigation responses to illicit activity is hugely important. Putting all three of those entities and then some in some sort of a consortium or a committee in New York City is hugely important, right? Open, make it formal, so folks don't waft in and out. It's something that, either folks are elected to or assigned to. I think is a very important step.
So I might be the only one from California here, but so I live in the Valley and have been working in startups for all of my life. And I think one thing that we continue to see is more and more security vendors, right? Today, I would say there are 2,000 or more cybersecurity companies in the market. Some of them are big, some of them are just two guys in an office somewhere trying to build the next, Symantec or Apple or Cisco. So there's a lot of innovation happening. What I think is unique here in New York is the adoption of new technologies. So when we're building these technologies and these startups in California, we're thinking, okay, this is our first customer. Like here in New York are the early adopters. That this is who we're going to target. Like if we're hiring salespeople, this is where we go first, because we're seeing a lot of that early adoption to protect the state, to protect the public sector, to protect the financials, right? They have innovation teams and scouting teams looking for the next technology to combat the latest threat. One thing that we've seen as well is over the years, every time we plug one hole, the attackers will find another one. It's literally a game of leapfrog, and it hasn't changed at all. Right, it's one of those problems in industries where you can work in this space your whole life and never solve the problem because it changes every time we have a new threat. There's a whole bunch of new companies solving that problem, and the attackers move on. And what I've seen is it's increasingly getting towards the human factor, right? So we talked about education, doing better education, educating people on what to look for, what not to do. I think the discrepancy in generations is a big factor, right? I was doing an interview yesterday with a reporter, and we were debating, her kids are millennials, and they don't care about privacy. They expect everything to be public, right? Whereas I don't even barely use Facebook. Being in security specifically, right? I just don't have time to use it, but I'd prefer not to. Again, nothing against our Facebook sponsors here, but everyone obviously, there's millions of people who do, and it's very successful. But the reality is, I think it's a combination of technology coming out of places like Silicon Valley or others, and then education, right? It's not just one problem that's easy to solve.
So when the fire service first started being involved with the intelligence community and working with law enforcement and in the CT mission, one of the barriers that we had to work past was the fact that we had to respect and come up with a mutual agreement for how we're going to deal with investigative information. So there might be a particular threat out there. We need to know the vulnerability, consequence information. We don't need to necessarily know the investigative information, whether it's classified or unclassified. We need to respect that. And I think that's probably along the same lines with what we're talking here this morning with cybersecurity. We need to know what the second and third order impact is. If we respect the investigative process, the privacy of information in terms of companies wanting to be careful about letting certain information out about how they were, maybe there was a cyber intrusion, but as public safety agency, we need to know what is the impact on us? How does it help our, hurt or help our response? All these different things down the line, that's where sort of it makes its greatest impact. So I think that's an area that we're getting much, much better at, but we still need to do some work on.
Great. And how likely do you think the private sector is to reach out if there is some sort of cyber intrusion? I don't know if you, down at the end there, could answer that, or, do you think that they're pretty forthcoming, or?
I think it's, to be honest, it's mixed.
Yeah.
Right, so there's plenty of companies out there that don't want to disclose for a variety of reasons that they've had an issue or they think they have an issue. There are still plenty of companies that probably don't trust whatever agency they go to. But at the same time, there's tons of folks that come to us with issues ranging from private sector to local police departments that have been hit by ransomware. And part of our job is to make sure that trust does exist, that I'm not here for some other purpose, that the big FBI or the big government's not here to also look at all your other data while we're trying to figure out how were you hit and how are you going to mitigate your problem. So some of that is still a trust issue. It has improved, but there's a long way to go.
That's a great point, Will. As I stated before, it was very inconceivable for Equifax to come to and let folks know 2 months later about their security breach. But it's real important and we find, it's real important for private companies to come and let us know about when there are breaches, but also citizens. When there's a breach with respect to cybersecurity, or when your email gets hacked or your phone gets hacked or what have you, very important for that to be reported. And we find that oftentimes that's underreported. I'm not special. I've been a victim of cyber security just a few months ago. I was paying a vendor for some goods and the vendor's email system was hacked, and a very similar email was sent to me asking me to pay the rest of the invoice, and it looked like it was a real invoice. It looked like it was a real invoice, and looked like it was a real correspondence. Until the next day, I called the vendor and I asked them, when am I going to get this shipment sent to me? And they said they never received the shipment. And that's when I contacted you guys, contacted NYPD, and tried to get that wire back. But it happened to me. So we are not, it could happen to any one of us. So we have to make sure that we report it to the authorities because, don't feel like you're the only one. And we do a better job when it's reported.
Great.
Yeah, there's one thing with the private sector. Reporting events usually becomes a matter of a legal process, right? They have their own ways of responding within a period of time because there are financial risks associated with that. But the one answer to that, which happened in the EU and the UK, first we mentioned a little earlier, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a stringent regulation, that's sitting on EU and UK residents to protect their data in a certain way. But there's one clause in there, one requirement is that, the attacked or hit entity has to report that they were hit within 72 hours. And we've seen in California, for example, something very similar to that that's becoming stringent, right? So that trend in terms of forcing the private sector to be more compliant and doing their fair share of responsibility, because inside of reporting that is the ability to stop the next attack or creating a wider threat surface. Because if it's a successful attack and the gun's unreported, which I dare say, pay attention to cryptojacking, it's a new kind of ransomware technique where they don't take anything away from the particular person. The most you get as an effect is a slowing down of your machine, so folks just are ambivalent about, talking about it, right? It didn't really hurt me that much, so, big deal. But it's a use of your machine to accomplish an illicit event, all right? So there may be more compliancy and regulations around how you, when you do find something that you're compelled to attach to the appropriate authority to report that. Otherwise, there's more, financial implications on the back end of that. So that may be one aspect of it. But I do think the private sector is reluctant to do that because a loss of, consumer confidence means dollars. And again, you have that tyranny between, do I do what's right for security or do I affect my bottom line? And that is an issue.
One thing that Darryl said is true. We are looking into, in the next session, to enter a bill similar to California's data protection bill that's going to be on this year's, I think it's going to be in this year's ballot on November 8th in California, that would have mandatory disclosure of such breaches.
Yeah, and I think the mandatory disclosure laws have definitely contributed to the reporting of issues. Obviously, you're now required to report them within a certain period of time, as Darryl mentioned. So that's made a big difference.
Great. So I think we have a few minutes for questions. Anyone has questions? Cards? Okay, so big question here, and I don't know if you can answer this, if it's classified or not, but are there plans in place for a worst-case scenario where every cyber connection is taken down? So basically, the internet collapses, sort of what we did to North Korea for a while, maybe.
No.
So I'm sort of a doomsday, no internet.
Well, one thing that we work.
I'm sorry.
One thing that the federal government is looking at, and we're looking at in New York State, is something called FirstNet, where we saw that when there are big disasters that happen, like 9/11, a lot of the systems go down, and we didn't have, folks could not communicate. But when folks can't communicate, our agencies can't communicate also. So we are trying to have a separate system that where the agencies can communicate no matter what, even if the systems go down or what have you, the broadband and the wireless systems go down, that we're still able to communicate. So that's something that we're making sure that that's properly funded. And that was an issue about whether it's going to be funded or how it's going to be. So FirstNet is something that we're working on.
Great. I guess somewhat related to that, are there plans in place if for instance, the power grid were taken out in New York City, we had no power for days?
It's all you.
I think some of the things that we're talking about is an understanding of infrastructure.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at, having the internet taken down as a hypothetical, pretty difficult. If we did a good job from a technology perspective in building high availability and redundancy into the network is one aspect. But a major, catastrophic event may happen more on the software side of that infrastructure, where you with a usual attack like a regular, denial of service attack to bring down services, essentially does bring down the internet. We've heard folks trying to break the internet or crash the internet. Some of that can happen. Matter of fact, unfortunately for Amazon yesterday with Prime Day, there were instances of overload, even with high availability and redundancy, where they did see episodes of issues happening. So things like that do happen. I think the one way to address some of that, which is some of the major issues for technology companies, is to go back to some basics and fundamentals, right? Sometimes we do a lot of things and we're future looking, and we put the tools in place to deal with attacks that happen now. But some of these attacks are relying on bad cyber hygiene, which I dare say sometimes happens in small and medium businesses, right? They have legacy information, legacy computers with older data, older software on it, easy to attack, easy to bring down. If that propagates onto the internet, which does have semblances of that type of legacy information, you could create an event. So I think one of the ways to address that is simple, patch management, if you will, to do good things of updating your systems in small, medium business, and I dare say in the public sector, like we heard a little earlier. Some of these environments can be old, can be slow to change and updating, and that is a risk. So going back to the basics sometimes would in most cases help from a very basic level address a large risk that's out there that could be considered a bringing down of the internet or power grids and things like that. But I would say again, the connection back to the private sector, looking at how you could fortify your infrastructure as a holistic perspective is also shifting the landscape on the bad actors. If they think they knew what your environment looked like on day one because of older infrastructure, older legacy equipment and software, then shift it, right? Mature your infrastructure, mature your environment, create a more feature-rich information, public and private sector, and move the landscape on the bad actors such that they have to spend more money and more time in attacking your infrastructure. They'll just move on to the next target if they're taking too long to breach who you are.
And I think we've seen that in the terrorism space as well. I mean, we've sort of fortified certain targets, so they've now engaged in these cruder, sort of less casualty attacks. So,
Just something, if I could add something on the consequence management. So every year we go through a process called the THIRA, Threat Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. And we look at a whole spectrum of potential threats, everything from a Category 3 hurricane to a terror attack, to a coordinated attack, all different types of things. And we look at it from a multi-agency standpoint. And what we find is that across the board, if we're prepared for one event, we're prepared for a lot others. So if we have a cyber event that affects our power grid, well, the preparedness for that is going to be very, very similar preparedness if we lose power because of another type of event. So what we're trying to do is come from an all-hazard type of perspective. In terms of preparedness, we break it down per agency. The NYPD, the FDNY, New York City Emergency Management looks at it. And we look across the board, private sector, and we break every single thing down. How many people can we evacuate? What are the expected vulnerabilities? What are the consequences? And we really try to look at it from a very scientific standpoint, down to hard numbers, down to hard metrics. What can we accomplish? And what's very important about that process is not only what we can accomplish, but what we can't accomplish, the gap, and then how did we get there? So whether it's a cyber event or any other type of particular attack, there is a very, very robust process for dealing with that, and we do every single year we deal with that, and it's also how we justify the grant funding and the other types of counterterrorism money that comes into the city. So it is a very defined process.
all right, in the interest of time, I think we need to wrap up. So I think hopefully on that note, we all feel a little better. So if you could give the panel a round of applause.
Great. Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you again to our panel. We'll go directly into our second panel. So if you could make your way to the stage. And just a few notes as they make